Why is my father's signature crossed out on a deed that was never supposed to exist in the first place? And why is it hidden under the altar of a church no one has stepped into for years, with dust thick enough to swallow light? At 61, Eleanor Hayes stood in front of that abandoned structure holding a folded property notice stamped sold, even though no sale was ever authorized in her name. Inside her coat pocket was a second paper she had never seen before. An old deed, brittle at the edges, marked with a faint embossed seal of her father's name. The wind pushed through the broken stained glass window above the entrance, and for a moment, it sounded like someone whispering from inside the walls. 3 days earlier, Eleanor was sitting alone in a one-bedroom rental on the edge of Millstone County, counting exactly $187 spread across a kitchen table covered with unpaid medical bills and a final notice from the clinic where she still worked part-time as a nurse. Her hands, once steady in operating rooms, now trembled slightly as she folded and unfolded the same letter from her family for the 5th time. We've handled Father's estate. Everything has been transferred. There was no signature from her, no call, no warning. Just silence and then erasure. The only thing they left her was a location, Route 9, an abandoned church her father had owned decades ago, now classified as non-productive property, no market value. Her sister had laughed on the phone when she asked about it. That place? Eleanor, it's basically rubble. Nobody even insures it. Still, she went. Not because she believed in miracles, but because she had nothing left that could be taken away. The drive took 43 minutes. Her old sedan rattled with every mile, the heater coughing out cold air that smelled faintly of rust. When she arrived, the church stood like a broken memory against the gray sky. Wooden doors warped, paint peeled away in long vertical scars, grass growing through cracks in the stone steps. Inside, the air was colder than outside, heavy with dust and something older, something like unfinished words. Eleanor stepped carefully down the aisle, her shoes echoing against the hollow floorboards. At the far end, the altar stood untouched, as if time had avoided it on purpose. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the deed again, comparing it with the faint markings carved into the wood beneath the altar's edge. That's when she saw it, the seam. Not natural wear, not age. A deliberate cut, sealed and then hidden beneath layers of polish and dust. Her breath slowed. Someone had been here recently enough to hide something, but carefully enough to make it look like it had always been forgotten. Behind her, the front door creaked again, though no wind had shifted. Eleanor didn't turn right away. Instead, she placed her hand on the altar, feeling a faint vibration beneath the wood, like something hollow waiting to be opened. And then, half hidden under the lip of the structure, she noticed it. A thin metal latch, scratched, almost invisible, as if someone had tried very hard to make sure it would never be found again. Eleanor's fingers stayed frozen on the edge of the hidden latch beneath the altar, but before she could pull it free, the entire weight of the church seemed to shift around her like it was holding its breath. Somewhere behind her, a second floorboard creaked, slow and deliberate, not like wind, but like someone choosing where to step. She turned her head slightly, just enough to see the shadow of the entrance door still swinging on its broken hinge. No one outside, no car engine, only silence, and that hollow vibration under the wood that refused to stop. 3 days earlier, there had been no mystery, only endings. The kind of endings that arrive quietly and don't ask permission. Eleanor sat at a small kitchen table in a rented unit off Route 9, the kind of place with peeling laminate counters and a heater that clicked too loudly every 10 minutes. On the table in front of her were 3 envelopes stacked in a crooked line. A final utility shutoff notice, a medical bill for $1,142.67, and an eviction warning giving her exactly 14 days to leave. Her bank app showed $187.43. Not enough for rent, not enough for medicine, not even enough to pretend she could negotiate her way forward. She folded the eviction notice again, pressing it into smaller and smaller squares until it fit into her palm like something she could control, even if only temporarily. In the corner of the room stood 2 cardboard boxes, her entire remaining life condensed into labeled cardboard. Clothes, documents, photo albums. The second box was heavier than the first, not because of weight, but because of what it contained. Her father's old papers, returned to her by a law office she had never trusted. She had been told the same thing 3 times in 3 different ways. The estate was settled, the property distributed, nothing more for her to claim. The family had already signed everything off. Her brother's voice still lingered in her memory, clean and rehearsed over the phone. Eleanor, don't make this complicated. It's just an old church. It costs more to maintain than it's worth. Worth. That word had followed her for months, reducing everything she had ever touched into numbers that no longer included her. She stood now in the cold interior of that same church, but it no longer felt like a building. It felt like a sealed sentence. As she lowered herself slightly, fingers brushing again against the hidden latch, something shifted behind her. Not loud, not dramatic, just a sound like paper sliding across wood. Slowly, she turned her head and saw it. A thin envelope had been slipped halfway under the front door, as if someone had been waiting for her to arrive before leaving it. No stamp, no return address, just her name written in faded ink across the front. And beneath it, a single line that made her stomach tighten before she even touched it. Do not open the altar unless you are alone. Eleanor stood in the abandoned church holding the envelope pressed under her fingers. The words "do not open the altar unless you are alone" still burning in her mind like something alive. Behind her, the air shifted again. This time not like movement, but like pressure changing inside a sealed room. The latch beneath the altar didn't move, yet it felt closer now, as if it had been waiting longer than she could understand. 3 days earlier, she had not been standing in mystery, but in rejection. The kind that arrives dressed as paperwork. She was at the county clerk's office, a place with fluorescent lights that hummed too loudly and chairs that smelled like old vinyl. On the counter in front of her was a thin file labeled Property Transfer Confirmation. The clerk slid it forward without looking at her. It's already been processed by the family representative, she said, as if that sentence ended all possibility of questions. Eleanor opened the file anyway. Inside was a deed listing her father's abandoned church on Route 9. Marked sold under a stamp so fresh it still looked wet. No signature from her. No duseresaschen. Just a transfer number and a county seal that didn't match any document she had ever seen before. That property has no market value, the clerk added quickly, almost rehearsed, as if repeating something she had said many times before. It's basically a liability now. Maintenance alone is more than it's worth. Worth again. That word pressed into Eleanor's chest like a weight she couldn't set down. Outside, the parking lot was half empty. Her brother's message came in while she stood there. Don't fight this. We already handled it. Take the settlement and move on. But there was no settlement. Only erasure. That evening, she drove anyway. The church was supposed to be nothing. Just a structure, old wood and broken glass, sitting on land no developer had ever bothered to bid on. A place her family called junk. Even the auction listing, buried in county records, had a note beside it. Sold as is. No inspections recommended. Yet she found herself gripping the steering wheel tighter as the miles passed, watching Route 9 stretch out like a forgotten line through empty fields. When she arrived, the gate was already partially open, as if someone had been here recently but didn't bother to close it behind them. No tire tracks were visible in the dirt, but the lock on the chain had been cut. Not broken, cut clean, precise. That detail stayed with her more than anything else. Because something precise did not belong to abandonment. Now, standing inside the church again, she felt the truth of that contradiction press against her skin. The envelope in her hand was heavier than paper. Should be. She didn't open it yet. Instead, she took a slow step toward the altar. The latch beneath it was no longer just a detail, it was a decision waiting to happen. And somewhere in the silence behind her, it felt like the building itself already knew what she was about to choose. The moment Eleanor stepped fully inside the abandoned church, the door behind her let out a slow, exhausted groan as if it regretted letting her in. Dust rose in a thin wave across the wooden floorboards, disturbed by air that had not moved in years. The smell hit first. Old varnish, damp wood, and something faintly metallic like rusted nails left in rainwater. Her flashlight cut through the darkness in short, unstable arcs, revealing rows of pews swallowed in shadow, their cushions torn open like someone had been searching for something long before she arrived. 3 days earlier, she had not yet seen this place with her own eyes. She had only the address, the deed, and the warning folded into her pocket like a threat she could not ignore. Now, every step she took made the building answer back. The floor creaked in uneven places, some boards sinking deeper than others, as if parts of the structure were no longer fully attached to what they once were. She set her small bag down near the entrance, the sound of it landing far too loud in the empty space. Inside it were only essentials: a folded blanket, a bottle of water, 2 cans of soup, and a worn photograph of her father holding her when she was a child. There was no home waiting for her elsewhere, only deadlines, bills, and the slow closing of every door she had once believed would stay open. She walked toward the altar, each step echoing upward into the high ceiling where broken stained glass filtered weak light into fractured colors across the dust. The altar itself stood intact but neglected, its surface coated in a film of gray that dulled everything it touched. A cracked Bible lay open but upside down, its pages curled from moisture. Behind it, a small wooden cabinet sat slightly misaligned with the rest of the structure, as if it had been shifted and never properly returned. Eleanor crouched and placed her hand on one of the pews, steadying herself. Her knees ached from standing too long, and the silence pressed in harder the deeper she went into the room. She pulled her coat tighter around her shoulders and checked her phone. No signal. 1 bar flickered and died. She tried calling her brother anyway. It rang twice before dropping into silence.
No voicemail.
No response. Only the church answering instead, with a distant hollow echo that seemed to come from somewhere behind the walls. As she moved along the side aisle, her flashlight caught details that didn't belong to abandonment alone. A coffee mug sat on the floor near the front pew, still upright, its handle cracked but not broken. An old pair of reading glasses rested on the altar step, lenses fogged with dust but carefully placed rather than discarded. And beneath the altar's edge, just at the limit of her light, she noticed something new. A faint seam in the wooden paneling that did not match the age of the rest of the structure, its edges too clean, too deliberate, as if someone had replaced a section long after the church had been left behind. Then she heard it. Not the wind, not the building settling. A soft, deliberate sound, like wood shifting against something hollow beneath it. The moment Eleanor heard that soft shift beneath the altar again, she froze with her hand still hovering over the seam in the wood. The sound wasn't random anymore. It repeated once, then twice, like something underneath was responding to her presence, adjusting itself in real time. Dust trembled faintly along the edge of the altar panel, as if air was escaping from a space that had been sealed too carefully to remain unnoticed. 3 days earlier, she would have called this imagination. Now, standing alone in a building that felt more like a sealed memory than a structure, she understood that silence could have waited. She did not open the hidden latch yet. Instead, she stepped back, exhaled slowly, and made a decision that had nothing to do with curiosity and everything to do with survival. If she was going to stay here, even for a night, this place needed to be made livable first. Outside, rain had started falling again, soft but steady, tapping against broken glass panels high above like fingers on a forgotten clock. She retrieved her small bag from near the entrance and unrolled a thin camping mat on the least damaged section of floor near the front pew. The wood there was slightly more stable, though still uneven, and she placed her folded blanket on top with careful hands. Her fingers were already stiff from cold and dust. She had worked long shifts in hospitals for decades, learned to move through exhaustion without complaint, but this was different. This was silence pressing back against her every movement. She checked her phone again. 2% battery. No signal. She placed it face down beside the bag as if refusing to watch it die. Then she began cleaning. Not because the church demanded it, but because she needed order to survive inside chaos. She found an old broom leaning behind the last pew and tested it. The bristles were worn unevenly, but it still moved dust. She started at the aisle, sweeping slow, deliberate strokes, gathering years of neglect into small piles that looked almost like ash. Her knees ached as she knelt to pick up broken glass near the altar steps, placing each piece carefully into an empty cardboard box she had found near the entrance. The smell of damp wood rose stronger as she disturbed the surface layers of dirt. At one point, she paused to tape a plastic sheet over a broken window using duct tape from her bag, pressing it tightly so the wind would stop cutting through the room. Her breath fogged faintly in the colder air that still leaked through gaps she could not yet fix. As she worked, fragments of her past surfaced uninvited. Night shifts in hospital corridors, hands steady while others panicked, the habit of noticing what others missed. That same instinct guided her now. When she reached the side of the altar, she noticed something new beneath the dust she had not seen before. A small wooden drawer embedded in the structure, slightly misaligned, as if it had been forced shut from the inside. She crouched, wiping it clean with her sleeve. On its edge was a faint mark, too precise to be damage, too intentional to be decay. Inside her pocket, her fingers brushed against the folded deed again, grounding her. She told herself it was probably storage, maybe old church records. Nothing unusual for a building this old. But as she stood, sweeping the last pile of dust into the box, something slid from a crack near the altar's base. A small, rusted key, dropping quietly onto the wooden floor with a sound too deliberate to be accidental. And in that moment, Eleanor realized she wasn't just cleaning an abandoned church anymore. She was clearing the space around something that had been waiting to be found. The rusted key landed on the wooden floor beside Eleanor's broom with a sound so precise it felt intentional, not accidental, as if the church itself had finally decided to respond. She stared at it for a long moment, the way a nurse studies a vital sign that doesn't match the chart, trying to understand whether what she was seeing was real or misread. The metal was old, darkened by time, but the edge of it caught the dim light in a way that suggested it still belonged to something that existed. Not abandoned, just hidden. 3 days earlier, she would have had no one to ask about it. No context, no witness to the silence pressing in from every wall. But now, the building no longer felt entirely alone. Footsteps outside broke the quiet. Not loud, not urgent, but steady, familiar in rhythm. Eleanor turned toward the entrance just as the door creaked open, and a man stepped inside carrying a small paper bag and a folded tarp over his shoulder. He was older, maybe late 60s, wearing a faded work jacket with the logo of a local hardware store stitched nearly invisible by wear. Rain clung to the edges of his boots. "Didn't expect to see lights on in here again," he said simply, as if speaking to a place that remembered his voice. Eleanor didn't lower her guard, but she didn't hide the key either. "I didn't expect to find this under your altar either," she replied, holding it up slightly. The man stopped, just for a second. Not fear exactly, recognition that didn't want to become language. He set the paper bag down carefully near a pew and glanced toward the altar without stepping closer. "That shouldn't be loose," he said. Then, after a pause, softer, "Not unless someone already broke what was supposed to stay sealed." He introduced himself as Harold Vance, retired contractor, occasional fixer for the church back when her father was still alive. The name landed in Eleanor's chest like a half-remembered photograph. "You knew my father?" she asked. Harold nodded once, but his eyes avoided hers for a moment too long. "Everybody here did. Some people just don't like remembering why." He pulled a small flashlight from his pocket and aimed it not at the altar, but at the floor near it where Eleanor had swept earlier. The beam caught something she had missed. Faint markings etched into the wood, partially hidden beneath years of dust and cleaning. Numbers, faded but structured like a ledger reference. Harold crouched slightly, tracing one with a finger without touching it fully. "He used to leave things here," he said. "Not sermons, not money, notes, records. People thought it was just storage at first." Eleanor picked up the rusted key again. "Storage for what?" she asked. Harold hesitated, then reached into his jacket and pulled out something unexpected. A small receipt, yellowed at the edges, stamped from a hardware store dated nearly 20 years ago. Eleanor recognized the logo immediately, the same store stitched on his jacket. On the receipt, one line was circled in ink. Heavy-duty lock replacement, church back entrance. "Your father paid for it," Harold said quietly. "But he never asked for the key to match the front doors." A distant roll of thunder pressed against the stained glass above them. Eleanor looked from the receipt to the key in her hand, then toward the altar again. Harold didn't explain further. Instead, he placed the tarp down beside her supplies, as if deciding something without saying it. "He helped a lot of people here," he added, voice lower now. "People who didn't have anywhere else to go. Some of them still remember more than they should." Eleanor studied him carefully. "And you?" she asked. Harold gave a small, tired smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I just fixed what needed fixing," he said. Then he paused, glancing at the altar one more time before turning back to her. "But there was one night, before everything closed up, someone came looking for what your father left behind. After that, he started hiding things instead of leaving them out." He tapped the wooden floor lightly with his boot. A hollow sound answered back, different from the rest of the structure, deeper, intentional. And as Eleanor followed the sound with her eyes, Harold quietly added, almost as if it wasn't meant for her at all, "He told me if anyone ever came back, they'd already be holding the right key." Eleanor's flashlight beam trembled over the altar again, catching the edge of the panel she had already noticed. A thin seam of wood painted a shade slightly lighter than the surrounding surface. Rain pelted the warped roof above, tapping out a slow rhythm that seemed to echo in time with her heartbeat. She crouched low and tapped the panel gently with the handle of her flashlight, listening. Hollow. A low, empty sound, like a drum beneath the layers of floor and wood. She reached for the screwdriver in her bag, testing the screws that held the panel in place. One corner was loose, yet the screws themselves had been driven from inside, as if someone had tried to seal it deliberately. The floor beneath her knees creaked, but she noticed something strange. A faint, linear scratch running from the base of the altar across the floorboards, leading toward the side wall where the old cabinet sat. Eleanor followed it with her eyes, tracing the irregular gouges, comparing them to the rest of the floor, noticing that some boards were newer, lighter, and inconsistently fastened. She pushed lightly on the cabinet with her shoulder. It rocked more than it should have if it were simply abandoned furniture. From the corner of her eye, the flashlight glinted off a small padlock on one of the drawers, the keyhole worn differently, suggesting it hadn't matched any lock in the building. Her hand went back to the altar, fingertips brushing the thin key she had found, turning it over slowly. Why would the boards be uneven? Why the old scratch leading to the wall? She tried to reason it away, settling into the idea that water had warped the wood, that someone had moved furniture decades ago, that the padlock was a relic. But the evidence kept stacking, insisting on attention. The sound of the rain outside slowed for a moment, only to be replaced by the distant screech of a car braking somewhere on the gravel lot, echoing through the broken windows. She froze, scanning the shadows, catching movement in a corner near the side entrance. Nothing visible, just a flutter of paper against the wall. A folded map of the county half obscured beneath a pew, one point circled in faded red ink. Eleanor's breath caught. The line of scratches, the mismatched floorboards, the padlock, the circled location on the map. They were all connected. Something had been deliberately hidden here, and her careful sweep of the church had just stumbled onto the first thread of its path. Her fingers brushed the panel again, pressing lightly, and she noticed the faintest give at the bottom, an opening waiting to be nudged. Eleanor pressed her palm against the loosened edge of the altar panel, feeling the wood give slightly beneath her fingers like a breath held too long finally escaping. The flashlight lay on the floor beside her, its beam trembling across the seams she had been tracing for the past several minutes. The rain outside had grown heavier now, hammering the broken stained glass in uneven bursts, but inside the church everything felt tighter, compressed, as if the structure itself was watching her decide what to do next. She looked at the rusted key again, then at the panel. Nothing about this was accidental anymore. 3 days earlier, she would have stopped at curiosity. Now curiosity was the only thing left that still felt like hers. She slid the screwdriver into the seam and applied steady pressure, careful not to force it too quickly. The wood resisted at first, then gave with a dry crack that sounded too loud in the empty space. Dust spilled out in a soft cloud, carrying the smell of old paper and something faintly metallic, like forgotten machinery. Beneath the panel was not empty space, but a narrow cavity lined with aged insulation and a small, rectangular metal box bolted into the frame. Eleanor froze for a second, her breath catching in her throat. The box was not part of the church's original structure. It had been installed later, deliberately, and hidden just enough to disappear beneath casual inspection. She reached in and touched it, cold, heavier than it looked. A small brass lock secured the front, but the rusted key in her pocket suddenly felt heavier, as if it had been waiting for this exact moment. Her hands were steady, but slow. She inserted the key. The lock turned with a reluctant click, like it hadn't been opened in years but still remembered how. Inside the box was a single folder, thick with aging paper bound by a frayed string. No label on the outside, only a faint stamp of the county seal partially faded across the corner. Eleanor lowered herself onto the floor, legs folding beneath her as she untied the string. The sound of it snapping loose felt too final. Inside were documents, property records, handwritten notes, and a deed copy so old the ink had begun to bleed into the fibers of the paper. Her flashlight illuminated a name repeated across multiple pages, her father's, but not just once. Multiple transactions, multiple entries, and then something that made her pause so sharply she had to grip the edge of the box to steady herself. A transfer record listing the church's land under her name, dated 5 years before her father had died. She read it again, slower, her throat tightening. The signature below it was hers, or at least it looked like hers, but the date made no sense. Her hands instinctively pulled the papers closer, scanning for explanation, for correction, for anything that would make it ordinary. Instead, she found a small folded photograph tucked between 2 pages. She hesitated before opening it. The image was faded but clear enough. The interior of this very church, but cleaner, active, lived in. And standing at the altar was her father, and beside him, holding a set of keys, was someone who looked unmistakably like Eleanor herself, though younger, standing in the exact same place she was kneeling now. At the bottom of the photo, in faint handwriting, was a single line that made her stop breathing entirely. The words at the bottom of the photograph were half-smudged, but Eleanor could still make them out if she tilted the image toward the flashlight just right. If you're seeing this, it means the door was never meant to stay closed. Her fingers tightened around the edges of the photo so hard she thought the paper might tear. The altar beneath her still felt hollow, the hidden metal box still open beside her, but now everything inside it seemed heavier than paper should be capable of holding. 3 days earlier, she would have dismissed this as some kind of clerical mistake, a misfiled record, a coincidence buried in old county paperwork. But nothing about the documents in front of her felt accidental anymore. Harold's footsteps echoed softly behind her before she even saw him. He didn't speak at first. He simply looked at the open box, the scattered papers, the photograph in her hands. Then, slowly, he lowered himself onto the edge of a pew, as if his knees already knew what they were about to remember. "So it was still here," he said quietly. Eleanor turned toward him. "You've seen this before?" Harold nodded, eyes fixed somewhere beyond the altar, not quite in the present. He reached into his jacket and pulled out something worn and folded. A ledger page, yellowed and brittle, the ink uneven as if written in a hurry or under pressure. He didn't hand it to her immediately. Instead, he traced a name on it with his thumb. Eleanor leaned closer. The ledger listed donations, repairs, and small expenses tied to the church, but between them were names of people, handwritten, some crossed out, some circled. And there, halfway down the page, was her father's name again, followed by entries marked storage, records, and hold until contacted. Harold finally placed the page beside her. "He never called this a church after a while," he said. "He called it a holding place." Eleanor's throat tightened. "For what?" Harold hesitated before answering, like the word itself carried weight. For people who had nowhere else their truth could go. He pointed toward the photograph still in her hand. That was one of the last days before things changed. Eleanor looked again at the image, her father at the altar, younger versions of herself standing beside him. But now, seeing the ledger in her hands, she noticed something she hadn't before. A faint stamp in the corner of the photo, matching a county legal office that no longer existed under that name. Harold reached into his pocket again and produced a small envelope, sealed but never opened. The paper was soft from age, addressed not to her father, but to her, Eleanor Hayes, written in handwriting she didn't recognize but somehow felt familiar in a way she couldn't place. "He told me not to mail it," Harold said quietly. "Said it wasn't time yet. Said if it ever came back to the church, it meant everything else had already been taken." Eleanor carefully opened the envelope. Inside was a single letter, and beneath it, a faded hospital receipt with her name printed on it from more than 20 years ago, listing payments she had never made, treatments she didn't remember. At the bottom of the letter, a final line made her hands go cold. The last line of the letter blurred for a moment in Eleanor's vision, not because the ink was faded, but because her hands had started to shake in a way she hadn't felt in years. Behind her, Harold didn't speak. He didn't need to. The silence in the church had changed again. It was no longer empty, but weighted, like something had been acknowledged that could never be unseen. 3 days earlier, Eleanor had believed she was holding the remains of a forgotten inheritance. Now, she was holding something that felt more like evidence than memory. The letter in her hands referenced accounts she had never heard of, tied to land records she had never signed, and a trust structure that listed not only her father's name, but hers as a secondary beneficiary under conditions marked active until confirmation of transfer. Beneath it, the hospital receipt repeated itself like a ghost. Eleanor Hayes, partial coverage, county assistance override, approved by Miller and Kessler Holdings. The name struck something cold in her chest. Harold finally exhaled. "That company doesn't exist anymore under that name," he said quietly. "Not officially." Eleanor carefully placed the letter down on the altar edge, as if it might change shape if touched too fast. "Why would my medical records be tied to land documents?" she asked, voice lower now, controlled, but tighter than before. Harold reached for the ledger page again, flipping it until he found a section he clearly didn't want to read aloud. When he did, his voice dropped even further. "Because your father wasn't just holding property," he said. "He was holding claims, easements, rights that weren't supposed to be visible outside county archives." Eleanor stood slowly, walking toward the side cabinet she had noticed days earlier. Her flashlight swept across the wood, now seeing it differently. She pulled the drawer open again, harder this time. Inside, beneath a false layer of fabric lining, she found a folded county map, old, precise, marked with multiple parcels highlighted in faint red ink. One of them was this church. Another was her old childhood address. Her breath caught as she compared the markings to the ledger page. The same numbers repeated across both documents, tied together like threads that should never have crossed. Harold stepped closer but stopped short of touching anything. "People came asking about this after your father died," he said. "Some with papers, some with offers. Some didn't bother pretending." As if on cue, Eleanor's phone buzzed in her pocket. Low battery, 1 bar of signal returning briefly. A new voicemail notification appeared, caller ID blocked. She didn't play it, but the preview text flashed on screen. "We can settle this quickly if you cooperate. That property is not safe for you to hold." Outside, a car engine idled somewhere near the gravel road, too smooth to be local. Eleanor didn't move immediately. Instead, she looked back at the ledger, then at the deed fragments, then at the hospital receipt still on the altar. Slowly, she understood that nothing in this church had been abandoned. It had been monitored, recorded, and waited on. And as she finally turned toward the altar again, Harold said something under his breath that made the air in the room feel suddenly much smaller. "If they're calling you now, it means they already know what the land is worth." And from outside, a second car door closed. Eleanor's phone vibrated again, the screen flashing a number she didn't recognize. But the message was clear. Immediate attention required regarding property. Call attorney. She didn't answer. Outside, she could hear the faint crunch of gravel under tires, then the sound of a car door closing. Moments later, the door to the church creaked, and two figures stepped in, dressed neatly, not rushing but deliberate. The taller of the two, a man in a charcoal suit with a briefcase, spoke first. "Ms. Hayes," he said evenly, "we're only trying to ensure fairness. This property is part of a family estate, and its value has been misrepresented. We'd like to discuss a proper transfer." Eleanor tightened her grip on the envelope and the ledger pages. She had only herself, her key, and a small camera to document everything. The man slid a set of documents across the pew toward her, each stamped and signed. Eviction notices, liens, a purchase agreement drafted in fine print she had no lawyer to review. "There's an unpaid lien from 2002, he added casually, tapping the top sheet. "It was overlooked in the original transfer. County procedure dictates it must be resolved before possession is confirmed." Eleanor felt the familiar ache in her knees from hours spent on the wooden floor, but her mind sharpened. She picked up her flashlight, illuminating the ledger, the deed, the stamped letter from the county, all of it carefully photographed with her phone. The second figure, a woman in glasses, added quietly, "We just want what's rightfully for the family. You understand? It's about stewardship." Eleanor glanced at the documents again. Each phrase, each number, each correction, felt like someone trying to rewrite history she had already begun to uncover. She noticed one line in the lien document that didn't match the ledger, a signature that seemed off, the date misaligned with the official stamp. She didn't speak. She didn't sign. Instead, she quietly slipped the envelope with the deed and the letter into her coat, securing it against her chest, and took a step back. The taller man's expression remained polite, controlled, but the slight tightening around his jaw betrayed awareness. This wasn't going to be easy. Eleanor exhaled slowly, focusing on the proof in her hands. Outside, the gravel shifted again, another vehicle approaching slowly, and as she looked back at the documents laid out on the pew, she realized with a chill that someone who had once called this property worthless now knew exactly how valuable it was, and they were prepared to act before the ink on their forms even dried. Eleanor walked into the county records office, the smell of old paper and polished wood pressing against her like a weight she had carried for decades. The room was quiet, the hum of fluorescent lights and the click of typewriters echoing faintly from memory, as if the building itself recognized the tension about to unfold. She laid out the deed, the ledger pages, the hospital receipt, and the photograph across the long oak table, arranging them with deliberate care so every signature, stamp, and faded ink mark could be seen. The man in the charcoal suit from the church appeared behind the counter, his hands resting lightly on a stack of forms, his polished shoes reflecting the overhead light. "We're only trying to follow procedure," he said, voice calm, measured, but Eleanor's eyes caught the slight tremor of his fingers as they hovered over the papers. She lifted the ledger, flipping to the page that showed multiple entries in her father's hand. Her name listed as beneficiary long before the official family transfers. A clerk nearby glanced, then paused mid-step. The room went silent. She pulled out the envelope containing the county-stamped deed copy, the paper soft and worn under her fingers. "All of this," she said quietly, "confirms every claim." The man's mouth opened as if to argue, then closed. "There must be an error," he said, voice still measured, eyes darting between the papers and her hands. Eleanor pointed to the ledger entry showing the timestamp from the hospital, the old receipt matching a payment her father had made decades ago. "Check the dates," she said, her voice steady, "and the signatures. They don't match your documents." She passed the photograph across the table, showing her father at the altar with the ledger clearly in his hands. He went pale, his pen hovering midair above the forms, as if the room had suddenly condensed all the evidence into a single moment of reckoning. Harold, standing quietly behind her, nodded toward a small envelope she had left on the counter containing a witness statement from a former neighbor, confirming her father's instructions regarding the property. The man's carefully rehearsed calm faltered. His mouth tightened, the mask slipping for the first time. Eleanor remained seated, holding the deed in her hand, feeling the paper's texture, the weight of proof she had carried alone until now. Each item she placed on the table, ledger, receipt, photograph, county deed, added another layer that could not be disputed. The room stayed silent for a long heartbeat, the only sound the faint drip of water somewhere near the vents. And as the man finally withdrew, shutting the stack of forms with a soft snap, Eleanor realized that she was no longer the person dismissed as powerless. The property once called junk had become authority, her evidence unassailable, and the question remained, what would she do now that the truth had begun to assert itself? Eleanor stepped back through the threshold of the church, the morning sunlight streaming through the broken stained glass panels, casting fractured colors across the pews she had spent days cleaning. The deed, once brittle and hidden, was now officially recognized in county records, stamped and signed. Her name restored where it had long been omitted, a silent acknowledgement of both ownership and justice. The envelope with the ledger and letters lay safely on the altar. They were no longer just evidence. They were a testament that her father's careful, secret work had not been erased, and that her life, though tested and overlooked, had meaning and continuity. The community slowly began to arrive. Neighbors who had once crossed the street now stopping to lend hands, carrying paint, hammering nails, cleaning debris, and sharing small meals at the makeshift table near the altar. A mother and her child peeked through the doorway, and Eleanor handed them the rusted key, now polished and functional. Saying nothing, the gesture alone communicated sanctuary and trust. Harold smiled quietly, nodding toward the altar where Eleanor placed the old photograph of her father upright, the ledger beneath it, transforming a corner of dust and decay into memory preserved and honored. Outside, a developer who had once offered to buy the property for pennies now left quietly, the weight of documentation and witness testimony preventing any further interference. Even her estranged siblings had to acknowledge her claim, signing letters that admitted she had acted in good faith and in accordance with the law. Eleanor touched the doorframe of the main entrance, feeling the texture of the wood under her palms, sensing the life that had returned to it. The building was no longer abandoned, no longer considered junk, but a place belonging to someone who had loved it, maintained it secretly, and now could protect it publicly. She went to the pew she had claimed as her own corner, unrolled her blanket, and for the first time in years, lay down with a sense of safety that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with being recognized and rightful. The rusted key lay beside her, no longer a symbol of uncertainty, but a marker of inheritance, perseverance, and the proof that she had never been invisible. A soft breeze carried through the broken window, ruffling the ledger and photograph. Eleanor opened her eyes and looked toward the altar, where sunlight hit the photograph and the deed simultaneously, revealing the faint inscription her father had left, almost imperceptible, yet perfectly clear now. Everything he had hidden for her was finally revealed, waiting for the person strong enough, patient enough, and worthy enough to find it.